I'm going to just give you more of an overview of pesticide labels and provide like the anatomy, how to navigate a pesticide label and what's required under federal regulation. The label is the law. You know, whatever label is attached to the pesticide that you're using at the time is the label that you should follow. I know that yesterday, you know, we discussed label amendments, and we've seen those, of course, from time to time, and that's not going to change. You know, recently you may have noticed changes on the, I guess most recently, the neonicotinoid pesticides with the pollinator protection language and some additional restrictions and information on those labels, but also the pyrethroid insecticides, recently had some additional restrictions. And then before that, rodenticides, many of the rodenticides were restricted. So anyways, we're going to continuously see label changes, but the thing to always remember is read the label on the product that you have, that you've purchased, and that's the label that you need to follow. Your responsibility as a fumigator, of course, is to read that label and know what it says. Now, when we talk about labels and what's required, you have to also think about labeling. So pesticide users must comply with all label instructions, but that also includes labeling. Yesterday we discussed the fumigation manual that is attached to the label with Vicane, and I believe Degesh talked about an applicator manual, and all those sort of things are considered labeling. So it may not be the actual label, but you can think about it as being part of the label because it does include requirements, and those are enforceable. So from a regulatory standpoint, when we look at labeling, much of that information is required. It's a must, not a maybe or you may do. So just real generally, what you should do before, of course, reading the label is when you're buying a pesticide, you should, of course, look at the label first. And there's certain information that you'll want to look at. Of course, and Jim talked about this yesterday, knowing what pest you're going to treat for, before you buy a pesticide. But before you buy the pesticide, you want to read the label to understand how the pesticide needs to be stored. Some pesticides require certain ventilation requirements or certain security requirements. So you need to make sure that, of course, you understand what those requirements are, but also that you're able to meet those storing requirements. Pesticide storage is part of pesticide use on the label. And then also mixing and applying the pesticide. For instance, if a fumigant or a termiticide, there's certainly a lot of specialized equipment that's necessary to make those applications. So you want to make sure that you have the equipment that you need to mix and apply the pesticide. Also, disposing of unused pesticide containers. Again, it's something you want to be familiar with. What's required, how can you dispose of those containers? And now we're going to start just going over the anatomy of a pesticide. And I know you all probably know this information. You've probably even seen some of these similar slides. But it's good to review this information because if you're like me, you're forgetful, and you're like, it's always good to have a refresher. But the trade brand name or product name. So in this example, the trade brand name product name is PlantGuard 50W. So to use a more relevant example, Vicane would be the brand name for the fumigant of sulfurofluoride. But in this example, the W stands for a wettable powder, and then the 50 indicates 50% of active ingredient, and it's an ornamental fungicide, and the manufacturer is listed here. Then all labels will have an ingredient statement. So the active ingredient is the chemical responsible for the performance or desired function of that pesticide. So in this example, this 7 is the trade name, and the active ingredient is carbaryl. Then you also have inert ingredients. As long as these inert ingredients are not hazardous, then they're not going to state exactly what chemicals they are. So EPA has a list of inert ingredients that are allowed, but that information is not specifically disclosed. Just the active ingredient is here. Now the chemical name, in this example, is this word here. And I'm not going to try to pronounce that name. Oftentimes they're not very easy to say, but that's the chemical name for this pesticide, chloranthanil. There's also commonly a short version of the chemical name, but there's only one short version of that name. Some other examples you're probably more familiar with are 2,4-D or permethrin, carbaryl, imidacloprid, fipronil is another one. So that's the common chemical name. Now again, restricted use or general use or unclassified is a statement required on all labels. So you'll see if it is restricted use, this statement, restricted use pesticide for retail sale to and use only by certified applicators or persons under their direct supervision, and only for those uses covered by the certified applicator certification. So this is something that's required to be on the label if it's a restricted use. Now, and again, a restricted use pesticide is when there's potential harm to humans, non-target organisms, or the environment. Applicators must be certified and demonstrate competence to use those type products. And the general use products have a lower toxicity and can be purchased and used by the general public. So you think about the different types of pesticides. You often hear, maybe not anyone in this room, but you'll hear, pesticides and insecticides. You hear that often. People think herbicides are not pesticides, but they're all pesticides, just like the fumigants are a pesticide or a disinfectant. But if you think about if you have a dog, or you have 12 dogs, would you say I have dogs and a Labrador? Or would you say I have dogs and I have one Labrador, one collie, one poodle, or something like that? But you're not going to say I have dogs and that. And that's you think about that similar to pesticides. There's pesticides and there's many different types, often based on the target pest. But the label will indicate what pests this product controls, and of course, insects would be insecticides would be insects, herbicides, plants, disinfectants, germs. Okay, and then we've got the net contents statement on the label. This is the amount of product. It can be expressed in pounds, ounces, gallons, or pints. And this is how you can determine the total active ingredient in that container. So dry formulations use a percent of active ingredient. So whenever you see AI, that stands for active ingredient. And liquids use the pounds per active ingredient per gallon equivalent on the label. So let's look at an example. So in this example, we've got a net content of 10 pounds. Our active ingredient is 25%. So what is the amount of active ingredient in pounds? All right, I think I heard 2.5 pounds. So if you need to calculate, that's how you would, that would be 2.5 pounds. But now down here we've got this product. It's 25% also. It contains 2 pounds per gallon. But the net contents of the container is 2.5 gallons. So here we would multiply 2 by 2.5, and it would be 5 pounds in that container. You've also got the name and address of the manufacturer on the label. The EPA registration, of course, we all know is on the label, unless it's a 25B exemption. So if the product falls into that category, you're not going to see that EPA registration number. But you want to ensure that you don't confuse it with the establishment number. The establishment number is where the product was manufactured. Signal words indicate the relative acute toxicity to humans and animals. Very low toxicity may not require a signal word on the label. You're always going to see all pesticide labels state keep out of reach of children, and that's also where you'll see the signal word. So the 4 signal words are danger, poison, danger, warning, and then caution. So let's look at those more closely. The danger, poison signal word means that the product is highly toxic by any route of entry. So the fumigants have a danger, poison signal word with the skull and crossbones. It also may see precautionary statements on there, hazards to humans and domestic animals. So in this example, this is a restricted use pesticide you can see here, and it's got the keep out of reach of children with the danger poison, which is in English and in Spanish. Then just the signal word danger indicates that the toxicity can cause severe eye damage or skin irritation, but it's not highly toxic if inhaled or swallowed. More signal words. Warning indicates that it's moderately toxic, either orally, dermally, or by breathing, or may cause moderate eye or skin irritation. And then caution, we're going down in toxicity, slightly toxic, either orally, dermally, or by breathing, and may cause slight eye and skin irritation. So we've got a warning statement here on this label, and you see it's right below keep out of reach of children. So that's where you can find it easily on the label. And here's a caution. Again, you see that in English and in Spanish on labels. So why is that always important? Of course, you need to know that signal word so that you protect yourself, but also when you're making decisions. And I know that Jim spent a lot of time yesterday talking about integrated pest management and making decisions about how to select a pesticide and how to decide if a fumigation is necessary. But just generally speaking, in pest management, you always need to ask your question. Once you do your pest identification, when you're selecting a product, to begin with, is a pesticide needed or not? And then are you selecting the least toxic chemical to give you the desired level of control? And so you have to think about what desired level of control is, and that's going to be based on the situation. Is it the one spider in someone's home, or is it a food processing facility that may have certain requirements? But when you're selecting the least toxic chemical, then you can refer to those signal words to help determine what is the least toxic chemical. Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit to precautionary statements and what those look like, which include routes of entry statements, such as may be fatal if swallowed or inhaled. Specific action statements like avoid contact with your skin or clothing is something that you want to know. Protective clothing and equipment statements. So this is where, under these precautionary statements, you'll find the personal protective equipment requirements, or PPE. So again, mixers and loaders, someone that's mixing a pesticide, obviously the risk of pesticide exposure is much more, and the PPE, or your personal protective equipment requirements, may be different than the applicator requirements. So you want to check the label and see, is in this example, a long sleeve shirt and long pants or coveralls worn over a long sleeve shirt, is required. Chemical resistant gloves. shoes plus socks, protective eyewear, chemical resistant apron. But you see, the applicators don't have all those requirements. So you want to make sure that you see what is required for each function there. Specific action statements. Many products are hazardous in more than one way. So in this example, the product causes irreversible eye damage. So you certainly want to wear eye protection, such as wear goggles or face shield, which came off of this label. But then it's also harmful if swallowed or inhaled through the skin. Do not get on eyes or skin or clothing. Avoid breathing the dust. So I suspect, respiratory protection, of course, is required to use this product. Again, follow all directions stated on the label. Lack of a statement does not mean that you do not need further protection. So you should, you just may want to always wear long pants and long sleeve shirts and shoes with socks, because okay, then you've at least got that covered. Other precautionary statements would require, if there was contamination on your clothing, remove and wash contaminated clothing, not for use or storage in and around a house. That's certainly important. So if the label states not for use or storage in and around a house, then you're prohibited to using that pesticide for that type of environment or site. Then the statement of practical treatment, first aid treatments for poisonings or accidental exposure. Hopefully you won't have any of these situations, but on the label you'll find a statement of practical treatment. If in this example, if in eyes, hold eyelids open and flush with a steady stream of water for 15 minutes and get medical attention. So if you don't read the label before you use it, how are you going to read the label if you have product in your eyes? And you're not going to know what to do here. So again, it's simple, but that's why you want to be sure and do that. If swallowed, then you need to call the Poison Control Center, but also drink 1 or 2 glasses of water immediately. This could essentially protect you and potentially prevent damage to your organs or body, or someone that you're aware of may have swallowed. I know that it unfortunately happens, but like in my state, we had an incident not too long ago where an applicator stored some insecticide in a Gatorade bottle, and they had it just thrown in the back of their truck, and they sort of left it there, and then a child got in the vehicle, days later, and it was a Gatorade bottle with concentrated insecticide, and they thought it was Gatorade, and took a swig, and it was unfortunately very bad consequences. The person did die. So it's important. That's sort of another message there. Not storing pesticides in their original container with the label on it to prevent those situations. But again, you've got if inhaled, what should you do? Get to fresh air. If on the skin, how to respond to that, get medical attention. So this is the statements of practical treatment that you'll, of course, want to read before you use the product. The statement of practical treatment is also good information for a physician. So if someone's taken to a hospital or emergency room or a doctor, then the doctor can identify how to respond. And if there is an antidote, which there's not always, what that antidote is. So you want to have your labels, of course, available and your SDS sheets in case of emergency. Environmental hazard statements. So these statements, of course, are related to the environment. So if the product is extremely toxic to aquatic, to organisms and invertebrates, then obviously that's something good to know. And I would think in Puerto Rico on the island, you're certainly concerned with water, since you have a lot of water everywhere, and preventing any exposure to the aquatic organisms. But you'll also see environmental hazard statements for honeybees. And this is a new, I call it the bee box, but this indicates that the product is harmful to honeybees, and there are additional requirements on use and precautionary statements related to honeybees. Physical or chemical hazards. This describes, if the product is flammable, and has some additional restrictions. Do not use, pour, spill, or store near heat or open flame. Do not cut or weld the container. Some products could be corrosive and should only be stored in a corrosion-resistant tank. So those are the physical or chemical hazards of the product. And these statements are not always in the same place. So unfortunately, with pesticide labels, sometimes it's not easy necessarily to find the information because it's not always in the exact same spot. But it's still information that you need to identify. Okay, lastly here, storage and disposal provides general instructions for how to dispose of the product properly and its container. So here we've got storage in a cool, dry, well-ventilated area, but not below 32 degrees. And does it get below 32 degrees anywhere in Puerto Rico? No, that's good. I didn't think so. Pesticide disposal, do not contaminate water, food, or feed by storage or disposal. Pesticide wastes are toxic. So if you're disposing of the pesticide, I know that some jurisdictions will have pesticide disposal or hazardous waste programs, so you can reach out to see if you have one on the island, or you can use the pesticide according to labeled instructions. But then the container disposal, oftentimes it might be a triple rinse and puncture, but there are different requirements, especially for aerosol cans. I'm sure Viking containers have other disposal requirements too. Directions for use. So this is how you can use the product. Obviously the site's intended for the product and where it can be used. Pests that the manufacturer claims will control the product. All this falls under use. How to mix and apply the product, and how to minimize drift. So the directions for use can be very long. It might be pages long, especially when you think about the fumigant labels. You're talking about many, many pages, so you do have a lot of information to read, but it's important information, and the label requires, before you use a product, to read the entire label. So let's look at examples of misuse, because everybody wants to stay, out of trouble. But you also, the label is, the cornerstone of pesticide regulation, but it ensures that the product is applied safely to protect you as the applicator, but protect other people, protect the environment. But as pest management professionals, you want the product to be effective. So following that label is going to improve the efficacy of the product. So, so that's important as well to, and another reason to be sure and follow the label. But as far as examples of misuse, applying to a site not stated on the label. So if the label restricts the product from being used in a residential setting, then that site would not be allowed by that label, and that would be considered a pesticide misuse. Applying at a higher than labeled rate is a misuse. Mishandling, such as storing near food or water, or the application area. I know something that we often see in my program are pesticides that are not allowed to be applied when food is being prepared. And that's so difficult to do pest management in restaurants because of those restrictions. So certain products you cannot use and where food preparation or handling is being done. So that would be considered a misuse. So remember, the host or the site must be on the label. but the pest does not necessarily have to be on the label. So you can apply products at a lower dose than specified on the label, generally speaking, but not at a higher dose. But you want to consider, the efficacy of the product. Do you want to reduce that dose if it's not going to be effective? Because if you have to do another application, then overall you might end up applying more product to manage that pest. Pesticides may be combined with other pesticides, unless it's prohibited by the label. So especially in agriculture and lawn care, there's often products that are combined if they're allowed to be mixed that way. Okay, just real briefly, the safety data sheets or the MSDS sheets, manufacturers are required to develop and provide upon request for each product. You can get this information from your dealer. It is part of pesticide labeling. Details about the product's composition, properties, hazards, and first aid procedures. Companies are required to keep SDS sheets for workers that come in contact with the substance. So we talked about that yesterday as being an OSHA requirement. So there are just like a label, there's different parts to an SDS sheet. You've got the chemical product information, the active and inert ingredients, the physical and chemical properties, such as solubility, vapor pressure, freezing point, boiling point, the hazards. Some of this information you'll also see in the label, but the SDS sheet is more complete. Acute, chronic information, and then also personal protective equipment requirements. So like I said, it's similar to the pesticide label. So now just some general information here before we wrap up. Following pesticide labels, again, you're probably tired of listening to me say it over again. You're probably going to hear it again today, but you must follow the label unless exemptions for specific uses are listed. State and local laws may override these exemptions. So you, of course, want to check with your local Department of Agriculture and those requirements. So just generally, just a review here, the site must be on the label when you make an application. That's very important. The target pest does not necessarily have to be on the label. Applications may be made at a rate less than stated on the label, but never more. And we talked about tanks mixes are okay unless the label states otherwise. So that is the anatomy of a pesticide label. Generally the requirements for you as an applicator for following the label.